morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he believed would be just another routine day. At 52 years old, Thomas had served the royal family for nearly 3 decades, his weathered face bearing the stoic expression that had become his trademark among the palace staff. His gray eyes, once bright with youthful enthusiasm, now held the weary look of a man who had seen too much and felt too little. Thomas had joined the Royal Guard straight out of military service, driven by a deep sense of duty and honor that his father had instilled in him during his own years serving the crown. Back then, the idea of protecting the royal family seemed like the highest calling imaginable. He had stood guard through countless ceremonies, state visits, and family gatherings, his presence as constant and reliable as the ancient stones of the palace itself. But something had changed in recent years. The death of his wife Margaret 2 years prior had left a hollow space in his chest that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. Their marriage had been childless, not by choice but by circumstance, and Margaret had poured her maternal instincts into her work at the local children's hospital. Thomas had thrown himself into his duties even more after her passing, using the rigid structure of palace protocol as a shield against his grief. This particular morning, Thomas took his position outside the palace's east wing, where the younger members of the royal family often spent their time. The area was quieter than the main ceremonial spaces, which suited his current temperament perfectly. He preferred the predictable routine of standing at attention, his mind focused on the simple task of watching and waiting, rather than dwelling on memories that brought nothing but pain. As he settled into his familiar stance, Thomas noticed the unusual activity in the gardens. Several groundskeepers were setting up what appeared to be a small obstacle course near the rose garden. Colorful cones and small hurdles dotted the normally pristine lawn, creating an almost carnival-like atmosphere that seemed oddly out of place in the formal setting of the palace grounds. Prince George appeared around the corner, his school uniform slightly disheveled and his backpack bouncing against his small frame as he ran toward the setup. At 10 years old, the young prince possessed an energy that seemed to illuminate everything around him. His blonde hair caught the morning light as he examined the obstacle course with obvious excitement, his blue eyes sparkling with the kind of wonder that Thomas had almost forgotten existed. The prince was followed by his younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, along with their nanny and a small group of palace staff who were clearly facilitating some kind of organized activity. Thomas watched as George immediately began testing the various obstacles, his natural athleticism evident as he navigated the course with impressive agility for someone his age. What struck Thomas most was not the prince's physical abilities, but the way he encouraged his younger siblings. When Charlotte hesitated at a particularly challenging hurdle, George doubled back to show her the technique, his patience and kindness evident in every gesture. When little Louis stumbled and scraped his knee, George was the first to reach him, offering comfort and distraction until the tears stopped flowing. Thomas had observed many members of the royal family over his years of service, but there was something different about Prince George. Unlike some of the adults who seemed burdened by the weight of their positions, George carried himself with a natural grace that suggested he understood his responsibilities without being crushed by them. He was polite to the staff, gentle with his siblings, and possessed a genuine curiosity about the world around him that made even the most mundane interactions seem meaningful. As the morning progressed, Thomas found himself paying closer attention to the young prince than protocol strictly required. There was something about George's easy laugh and genuine interest in others that reminded Thomas of qualities he had once valued in himself, but had somehow lost along the way. The boy seemed to possess an innate understanding that his position came with the responsibility to lift others up rather than to elevate himself above them. During a brief break in the activities, Thomas noticed George looking in his direction. For a moment their eyes met across the garden, and Thomas was surprised by the directness of the prince's gaze. There was no shyness or uncertainty in those young eyes, but rather a frank curiosity and what appeared to be genuine interest. George raised his hand in a small wave, and Thomas, caught off guard by the unexpected gesture, managed a slight nod in response before resuming his professional demeanor. The interaction lasted only seconds, but it left Thomas with an unusual feeling of warmth that he had not experienced in years. There was something in that simple acknowledgement that pierced through the emotional armor he had carefully constructed around himself. For the first time in months, Thomas found himself genuinely curious about another person rather than simply going through the motions of his daily routine. As the morning activity concluded, and the royal children were led back toward the palace, Thomas remained at his post, but his mind wandered to thoughts of his own childhood and the dreams he had once harbored. He remembered the enthusiasm he had felt when he first donned the uniform, the pride that had swelled in his chest when he took his oath of service. Somehow, in the space of a few hours, a 10-year-old boy had managed to remind him of feelings he thought he had lost forever. The day continued with its usual rhythm of changing guards, scheduled patrols, and brief conversations with colleagues, but Thomas found that his perspective had shifted slightly. Where once he had seen only duty and routine, he now noticed small details that had previously escaped his attention. The way the afternoon light filtered through the palace windows, the sound of distant laughter from the staff quarters, the sense of history that permeated every corner of the ancient building. That evening, as Thomas walked home to his empty flat, he realized that something fundamental had changed. The encounter with Prince George had awakened something in him that he had thought was permanently buried with Margaret. It was not happiness exactly, but rather a recognition that the capacity for connection and meaning still existed within him, waiting to be rediscovered. The following weeks brought an unexpected change to Thomas's routine at the palace. He found himself assigned more frequently to the areas where the royal children spent their time, a shift that his supervisor explained as being due to his exemplary record and the trust the family placed in his discretion. Thomas suspected there might be more to it than that, but he accepted the assignment without question, secretly grateful for the opportunity to observe the young royals more closely. Prince George seemed to have developed a habit of acknowledging Thomas whenever their paths crossed. It began with simple nods and waves, but gradually evolved into brief conversations when circumstances allowed. The prince would ask about Thomas's day, comment on the weather, or share observations about the palace gardens that showed a surprising level of attention to detail for someone his age. What impressed Thomas most was George's genuine interest in the people around him. The prince knew the names of the gardeners, remembered personal details about the kitchen staff, and showed real concern when someone seemed unwell or troubled. There was nothing performative about these interactions. They appeared to spring from a natural empathy that set him apart from many adults Thomas had encountered. One particularly memorable morning, Thomas was standing guard near the music room when he heard the sound of piano playing drifting through the closed door. The melody was complex and beautiful, played with a skill that surprised him. When the music stopped and the door opened, Prince George emerged, looking slightly frustrated. "That was beautiful, Your Royal Highness," Thomas said, momentarily forgetting protocol in his genuine admiration. George looked up, his face brightening at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you, but I keep making mistakes in the middle section. It's quite frustrating, actually." "Music can be challenging," Thomas replied, remembering his own brief attempt to learn the guitar in his youth. "My wife used to say that the mistakes make the music more human." The prince paused, studying Thomas with that direct gaze that had become familiar. "You mentioned your wife before. Does she enjoy music as well?" Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of Margaret, but something in George's earnest expression made him want to answer honestly. "She did, yes. She passed away 2 years ago, but she loved all kinds of music. She said it was like medicine for the soul." George's expression immediately became serious, showing a maturity that seemed far beyond his years. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Thomas. That must be terribly difficult." The simplicity and sincerity of the response caught Thomas completely off guard. He had received countless expressions of sympathy after Margaret's death, but most had felt hollow or obligatory. George's words carried a weight of genuine understanding that seemed impossible from someone so young. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. That means more than you know." George nodded solemnly, then seemed to make a decision. "Would you like to hear the piece I was practicing? I could play it from the beginning, mistakes and all." Thomas was touched by the offer, but felt the need to maintain appropriate boundaries. "That's very kind, but I should remain at my post." "Of course," George said, understanding immediately. "Perhaps another time when you're not on duty." The conversation stayed with Thomas throughout the day and into the evening. There had been something profound about the exchange that went beyond the prince's polite sympathy. George had somehow managed to acknowledge Thomas's loss without making him feel pitied or diminished by it. Instead, the brief conversation had left Thomas feeling seen and valued in a way that he had not experienced since Margaret's death. As the days passed, Thomas began to notice other aspects of Prince George's character that impressed him. The boy showed remarkable patience with his younger siblings, often sacrificing his own activities to help them with theirs. He was unfailingly polite to the staff, but never in a way that seemed forced or artificial. Most remarkably, he seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of when someone needed encouragement or support. Thomas observed George comforting a young maid who had accidentally broken a valuable vase, assuring her that accidents happen and helping to clean up the mess before anyone else noticed. He watched the prince spend an entire afternoon teaching Prince Louis how to properly hold a cricket bat, celebrating each small improvement with genuine enthusiasm. He saw George quietly give his own dessert to Princess Charlotte when she dropped hers, pretending he was not hungry rather than making her feel bad about the mishap. These small acts of kindness began to accumulate in Thomas's mind, creating a picture of a young person who understood instinctively that his privilege came with the responsibility to use it in service of others. There was no arrogance or entitlement in George's behavior, only a natural inclination toward compassion that seemed to guide his every interaction. The realization slowly dawned on Thomas that he was witnessing something remarkable. In an age when young people were often criticized for being self-centered or entitled, Prince George represented something different entirely. He embodied the best traditions of royal service while maintaining the innocence and wonder that made him genuinely likable as a person. Thomas found himself looking forward to these encounters with an enthusiasm that surprised him. After months of moving through his duties with mechanical precision, he was rediscovering the satisfaction that came from being part of something meaningful. The royal family was not just a collection of important people to be protected. They were individuals with their own struggles, joys, and complexities. One evening, as Thomas was completing his final patrol of the day, he encountered Prince George in the palace library. The young prince was curled up in a large armchair, reading a book about British history. When he noticed Thomas, he looked up with a smile. "Good evening, Thomas. How has your day been?" "Very well, thank you, Your Royal Highness." "And yours?" "Quite good, actually. I've been reading about some of my ancestors, and it's fascinating how much responsibility they carried, even as children." George paused, then continued thoughtfully. "Do you ever wonder about the people who served them? The guards and staff who helped them navigate their duties?" Thomas was struck by the question's depth and the genuine curiosity behind it. "I think about it sometimes, yes. Service has always been an honor, regardless of the era." George nodded seriously. "I hope that when I'm older I can be worthy of the kind of dedication and loyalty that people like you show every day." It must require a special kind of person to dedicate their life to protecting others. The comment left Thomas speechless for a moment. In all his years of service, no member of the royal family had ever acknowledged his work in such personal terms. The recognition meant more to him than any official commendation or ceremony ever could. The autumn months brought a noticeable change in the atmosphere at Kensington Palace. The shorter days and cooler weather seemed to create a more intimate environment, with the royal family spending more time indoors and the staff working in closer proximity to their daily activities. For Thomas, this meant more opportunities to observe the family dynamics and, in particular, to witness Prince George's continuing development as both a young person and a future member of the monarchy. It was during this period that Thomas began to notice subtle signs of the pressure that George was beginning to feel as he grew older. The boy was still cheerful and kind, but there were moments when Thomas caught glimpses of a more serious, almost melancholy expression crossing his young features. These instances were brief and quickly replaced by George's usual bright demeanor, but they suggested that the prince was beginning to understand the weight of his future responsibilities. One particularly gray October morning, Thomas was stationed outside the schoolroom where George received his private tutoring when he heard raised voices from within. Through the partially open door, he could see George standing before his tutor, his small hands clenched at his sides and his face flushed with frustration. I don't understand why I have to learn about all these boring ceremonies and protocols, George was saying, his voice strained with emotion. Why can't I just learn normal things like other children? The tutor, a stern woman in her 60s, responded with practiced patience but little warmth. Your Royal Highness, these are not optional subjects. Your position requires extensive knowledge of royal protocol, constitutional law, and ceremonial procedures. These lessons are as important as any academic subject. But I'm only 10 years old, George protested, his voice cracking slightly. I want to learn about science and history and books that make me excited to read them. All this ceremony stuff makes me feel like I'm being prepared for a job I never asked for. Thomas felt his heart clench at the raw honesty in the young prince's voice. Here was a child grappling with concepts that most adults would find overwhelming, trying to balance his natural curiosity and desire for a normal childhood with the inexorable demands of his birthright. The tutor's response was predictably unsympathetic. Your Royal Highness, your position is not a matter of personal choice. It is a duty that has been passed down through generations, and it requires sacrifice and dedication from an early age. The sooner you accept this reality, the easier your transition to adulthood will be. George fell silent at this rebuke, but Thomas could see the dejection in his posture. The boy's shoulders sagged as he returned to his desk, and when he picked up his pen to continue his work, his movements were mechanical and lifeless. The vibrant, enthusiastic child that Thomas had come to know seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a small figure who looked overwhelmed by forces beyond his control. The lesson continued for another hour, with George dutifully completing his exercises in royal protocol, while his natural enthusiasm remained conspicuously absent. When the session finally ended and the tutor departed, George remained seated at his desk, staring out the window with an expression that seemed far too mature for his years. Thomas found himself facing a dilemma. His position required him to maintain professional distance and avoid interfering in family matters, but his growing affection for George made it difficult to watch the boy struggle without offering some form of support. After a moment of internal debate, Thomas made a decision that would have surprised his former self. He knocked gently on the door frame and entered the schoolroom. Your Royal Highness, I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to check if everything was all right. George looked up, and Thomas was startled to see unshed tears in the boy's eyes. Oh, hello, Thomas. I'm fine, thank you. Just tired from lessons. Thomas could see that George was trying to maintain his composure, but the strain was evident. Without overthinking his actions, Thomas moved closer and spoke in a gentle voice that he had not used in years. You know, Your Royal Highness, I've been thinking about something you said the other day, about wanting to be worthy of the people who serve you. I think you might have it backward. George looked puzzled. What do you mean? Thomas sat down in the chair beside George's desk, abandoning protocol in favor of human connection. I think the real question is whether we, the people who serve, can be worthy of you. In all my years here, I've never seen anyone your age show such genuine care for others. You have a gift for making people feel valued and important. That's not something that can be taught in protocol lessons. George's expression began to brighten slightly. But my tutor says I need to learn all these rules and ceremonies. She makes it sound like nothing else matters. Rules and ceremonies are important, Thomas acknowledged, but they're just the framework. What really matters is the person who brings those traditions to life. I've watched you with your siblings, with the staff, with everyone around you. You already understand the most important part of being royal, which is treating people with kindness and respect. George was quiet for a moment, absorbing Thomas's words. Sometimes I feel like I'm being prepared to become someone I don't want to be. Someone serious and formal who never gets to just be normal. Thomas felt a surge of protective feeling toward this thoughtful, vulnerable child. Your Royal Highness, I knew your grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, when she was not much older than you are now. Even then, she had the same kind of natural grace and genuine concern for others that I see in you. But she was still able to find joy in her life, to pursue her interests and to maintain relationships that brought her happiness. Being royal doesn't mean giving up who you are. It means finding ways to express who you are in service to others. George's face lit up with interest. You really knew my great-grandmother when she was young? I did indeed. And she would have been very proud of the young man you're becoming. She understood that true nobility comes not from following rules perfectly, but from caring about people and using your position to make their lives better. For the first time that day, George smiled genuinely. "Thank you, Thomas. That helps me feel better about things." Thomas stood to leave, then paused and turned back. "Your Royal Highness, if I may say so, the world needs more people like you. People who ask questions, who care about fairness, who want to make things better for everyone. Don't let anyone convince you that those qualities are weaknesses. They're your greatest strengths." As Thomas left the schoolroom, he reflected on the conversation with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He had crossed several professional boundaries in speaking so personally with Prince George, but he could not bring himself to regret it. The boy needed someone to remind him that his humanity was not a liability, but an asset. The weeks following Thomas's conversation with Prince George brought an unexpected development that would forever change their relationship. Thomas had been struggling with a persistent cough and fatigue that he had initially attributed to the changing season and his advancing age. However, when the symptoms worsened and he began experiencing chest pains, his supervisor insisted that he seek medical attention. The diagnosis came as a shock. Thomas had developed a serious respiratory condition that, while not immediately life-threatening, would require extensive treatment and significant lifestyle changes. The palace physician was clear that the long hours and physical demands of guard duty were no longer advisable for someone in his condition. Thomas was faced with the reality that his career of service was coming to an abrupt end. The news hit Thomas harder than he had expected. For nearly 3 decades, his identity had been tied to his role as a royal guard. The uniform, the routine, the sense of purpose that came from protecting the royal family. These had been the constants that had given structure and meaning to his life, especially after Margaret's death. The prospect of retirement, of losing his connection to the palace and the people he had come to care about, filled him with a dread that was almost overwhelming. Thomas tried to keep his condition private, but in the close-knit community of the palace staff, such secrets were difficult to maintain. Word gradually spread that he would be leaving his position, though the exact details remained unclear to most. He noticed subtle changes in how his colleagues interacted with him. There was a kindness and consideration that hadn't been there before. The way people treated someone they knew was facing a significant life change. Prince George seemed to sense that something was different, even before he learned the specific details. During their brief encounters, the boy's usual cheerful greetings were accompanied by searching looks, as if he was trying to understand what he was observing. George had always been perceptive, but his attention to Thomas's well-being during this period showed a level of emotional intelligence that was remarkable for someone his age. The moment of revelation came on a crisp November morning, when Thomas was completing what he did not yet know would be one of his final patrols. Prince George approached him with his characteristic directness, but there was an unusual seriousness in his expression. "Thomas, are you feeling all right? You seem different lately, and some of the staff have been talking in hushed voices when they think I'm not listening." Thomas was caught off guard by the prince's forthright question. He had been dreading this conversation, knowing that George would eventually learn about his departure but hoping to delay it as long as possible. Now faced with those clear blue eyes and genuine concern, he found himself unable to deflect or dissemble. "Your Royal Highness, I appreciate your concern. I have been dealing with some health issues that will require me to step back from my duties here at the palace." George's expression immediately became grave. "Are you seriously ill? Is there anything that can be done to help you?" The simple, heartfelt concern in the prince's voice moved Thomas deeply. "It's manageable with proper treatment, but it means I'll need to retire from active service. I'll be leaving my position here within the next few weeks." For a moment, George said nothing, processing this information with the careful consideration that Thomas had come to associate with the boy's approach to serious matters. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "That's terrible news, Thomas. Not just because you're unwell, but because the palace won't be the same without you. You've been so kind to me and my family. Is there anything at all that can be done to help you stay?" Thomas was touched by George's immediate focus on finding a solution, rather than simply accepting the situation. "I'm afraid not, Your Royal Highness. The doctors have been quite clear about the limitations my condition will place on my activities." George fell silent again, and Thomas could almost see the wheels turning in the boy's mind. There was something in his expression that suggested he was formulating a plan, though Thomas could not imagine what that might entail. "Will you be all right financially?" Do you have somewhere to go? People to take care of you? The question revealed both George's practical concern and his understanding that Thomas's departure might leave him isolated and vulnerable. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful inquiry that had made Thomas so fond of the young prince. The palace has been very generous with my pension arrangements, and I have a small flat that will suit my needs. But I will miss this place and the people here more than I can express. George stepped closer, his young face serious with determination. Thomas, you've been like a friend to me these past months. You've helped me understand things about my position and about being a good person that no one else has explained in the same way. I don't want you to leave feeling like your service hasn't been appreciated. The sincerity in George's voice was almost overwhelming. Thomas had received official recognition for his service over the years, but no commendation had ever meant as much as this simple statement from a 10-year-old boy. Your Royal Highness, knowing that I've been able to help you in some small way is more meaningful to me than any formal recognition could ever be. You have a remarkable capacity for kindness and understanding that gives me great hope for the future. George smiled at this, but Thomas could see that the boy was still troubled by the situation. Is there anything I can do? Any way I can help make this transition easier for you? Thomas was moved by the offer, but he also recognized that there were limits to what even a young prince could accomplish in such circumstances. Your friendship and concern are more help than you know. Just knowing that you care makes this much easier to bear. George nodded solemnly, but Thomas noticed that he seemed to be holding something back, as if he were considering possibilities that he was not yet ready to discuss. The conversation concluded with George's promise to visit Thomas before his departure, but there was something in the boy's manner that suggested their story together was far from over. That evening, as Thomas walked home through the London streets, he reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken. The prospect of retirement still filled him with uncertainty and loss, but his relationship with Prince George had given him something precious that he had not anticipated. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt that his life had touched another person in a meaningful way, that his existence had made a positive difference in someone else's world. The irony was not lost on him that a child had been the one to restore his sense of purpose and connection. Prince George had reminded him that service was not just about following orders or maintaining protocols, but about the human connections that gave meaning to duty and responsibility. Thomas's final week of active duty at Kensington Palace was filled with the bittersweet rituals of farewell. His colleagues organized a small gathering in his honor, sharing stories and memories from his long years of service. The palace administration presented him with a formal letter of commendation and a modest ceremonial gift. These gestures were appreciated, but they felt somehow incomplete, lacking the personal connection that had come to mean so much to him during his final months of service. What Thomas did not expect was the level of attention that Prince George was paying to his departure. The young prince seemed to appear wherever Thomas was stationed, finding excuses to check on him and engage in brief conversations. There was something purposeful about these encounters that went beyond mere politeness or casual concern. On his second-to-last day, Thomas was surprised to receive a formal request to meet with Prince George in the palace library at the end of his shift. Such requests were unusual, and Thomas found himself curious about what the prince might want to discuss. When he arrived at the appointed time, he found George waiting with an expression that was both serious and excited. "Thank you for coming, Thomas. I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to speak with you privately before you leave us." Thomas took a seat across from the prince, noting that George seemed unusually formal in his manner. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. How can I be of service?" George took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for what he was about to say. "Thomas, I've been thinking a great deal about our conversations over the past months, and about what you've meant to me and my family. I know that your departure is due to health concerns that can't be changed, but I wanted you to know that your influence has been more important than you might realize." Thomas was touched by the sentiment but puzzled by the formal tone. "Your Royal Highness, you're very kind to say so. Getting to know you has been one of the greatest privileges of my career." George nodded, then continued with increasing confidence. "I've been talking with my parents about you, about the kind of person you are and the way you've helped me understand my responsibilities. They've been very interested in hearing about our conversations and the advice you've given me." This revelation surprised Thomas. He had assumed that his interactions with George were largely private and informal, The idea that the prince had been discussing their relationship with the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge was both flattering and slightly concerning. "I hope I haven't overstepped any boundaries, Your Royal Highness. I would never want to cause any difficulties." George smiled reassuringly. "Not at all. In fact, my parents are quite grateful for the positive influence you've had on me. They've noticed changes in how I approach my studies and my understanding of my role. They wanted me to express their appreciation to you personally." Thomas felt a warm glow of satisfaction at this unexpected recognition. Throughout his career, he had rarely received direct feedback about his work beyond the formal evaluations and commendations. To know that his relationship with George had been noticed and valued by his parents was deeply meaningful. "That means a great deal to me, Your Royal Highness. I hope I've been helpful in some small way." George's expression became more serious, and Thomas sensed that they were approaching the real purpose of this meeting. "Thomas, I know that your health requires you to step back from active duty, but I've been wondering if there might be other ways for you to remain connected to the palace and to continue helping me as I grow up." Thomas was intrigued but uncertain about what George might be suggesting. "I'm not sure what you mean, Your Royal Highness." George leaned forward slightly, his excitement becoming more apparent. "What if there was a position that didn't require the physical demands of guard duty, but would allow you to use your experience and wisdom in other ways? Something that would let you stay involved in palace life while accommodating your health needs?" The suggestion caught Thomas completely off guard. "Your Royal Highness, I'm deeply touched by the thought, but I'm not sure what such a position might entail." George's smile widened, and Thomas could see the boy's natural enthusiasm breaking through his formal demeanor. "My parents have been thinking about the idea of having someone serve as a kind of mentor and advisor, particularly for the younger members of the family. Someone who understands both the traditions of the palace and the importance of maintaining our humanity within those traditions." Thomas stared at the prince, trying to process what he was hearing. "Are you suggesting some kind of advisory role?" "Exactly. Someone who could help with the transition between the formal education we receive and the practical realities of royal life. Someone who could provide the kind of guidance and perspective that only comes from years of experience and genuine care for the family." The proposal was so unexpected that Thomas found himself momentarily speechless. After months of preparing for the end of his connection to the palace, the possibility of continuing in a different capacity was almost overwhelming. "Your Royal Highness, this is incredibly generous, but are you certain that such a position would be appropriate? I'm just a guard after all." George's expression became earnest, and when he spoke, his voice carried a conviction that belied his young age. "Thomas, you're not just anything. You're someone who has dedicated his life to service, who understands the weight of responsibility, and who has shown me that it's possible to fulfill your duties while remaining kind and authentic. Those are exactly the qualities that someone in my position needs to learn from." Thomas felt his eyes beginning to moisten, moved by the depth of George's faith in him. "I don't know what to say, Your Royal Highness. The idea is wonderful, but would your parents truly approve of such an arrangement?" George's smile became almost mischievous. "Actually, Thomas, the idea originally came from them. After I told them about how you've helped me understand things, they began discussing whether there might be a way to formalize that kind of mentorship. When they learned about your health situation and your upcoming departure, they asked me to speak with you about the possibility, though revelation that this conversation had been orchestrated by the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge added a level of legitimacy that Thomas had not dared to imagine. The possibility that his years of service and his relationship with George might lead to an entirely new chapter in his life was almost too good to believe. "This is an extraordinary opportunity, Your Royal Highness. I would be honored to continue serving the family in whatever capacity might be helpful." George's face lit up with genuine joy. "Wonderful. My parents will be so pleased. They wanted to speak with you formally about the details, but they asked me to gauge your interest first." As Thomas left the library that evening, his mind was spinning with the unexpected turn his life had taken. What had seemed like an ending was now potentially a new beginning, an opportunity to continue his service in a way that honored both his experience and his limitations. The formal meeting with the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge took place 3 days later, in the private sitting room of their Kensington Palace apartment. Thomas had never been in such an intimate setting with senior members of the royal family, and despite his decades of service, he found himself nervous about the encounter. He had spent considerable time preparing for the conversation, thinking through what he might contribute in an advisory role and how his experience could be valuable to the younger generation of royals. Prince William and Catherine received him with a warmth that immediately put him at ease. They had clearly given serious thought to the proposal, and their questions demonstrated a genuine understanding of both the opportunities and challenges that such an arrangement might present. "Sergeant Mitchell," Prince William began, "George has told us a great deal about your conversations and the impact you've had on his understanding of his role. We've been impressed by his increased maturity and thoughtfulness over the past months, and we understand that you've played a significant part in that development." Catherine nodded in agreement. What struck us most was George's description of how you've helped him see his position as an opportunity to serve others, rather than as a burden to be endured. That perspective is exactly what we hope all our children will develop as they grow up. Thomas felt a surge of pride at their words, but also a deep sense of responsibility. "Your Royal Highnesses, Prince George is a remarkable young man with natural instincts for kindness and service. I may have offered some perspective, but the qualities you're seeing were already there." Prince William smiled. "That's exactly the kind of humility and wisdom we're looking for. We're not interested in someone who would try to take credit for our children's development, but rather someone who could guide and support them as they navigate the unique challenges of their positions." Catherine leaned forward, her expression serious but encouraging. "We've been thinking about this role as a kind of bridge between the formal education our children receive and the practical realities of royal life. Someone who could provide historical context, help them understand the human side of their responsibilities, and offer guidance based on real experience within the royal household." The scope of what they were proposing began to become clear to Thomas. This was not simply a ceremonial position or a way to keep him connected to the palace out of kindness. They were envisioning a genuine advisory role that would require him to draw on all his years of experience and observation. "What specific responsibilities did you have in mind?" Thomas asked, wanting to understand exactly what would be expected of him. Prince William exchanged a glance with Catherine before responding. "We were thinking of a flexible arrangement that could evolve based on the children's needs and your health limitations. Regular conversations with George and his siblings about royal history, protocol, and the reasoning behind various traditions. Help them understand the perspectives of the staff and the broader public. Perhaps most importantly, serve as someone they could turn to for honest advice and guidance as they face difficult decisions." Catherine added, "We also thought you might be able to help them understand the service aspect of their roles. You've dedicated your life to protecting and serving the royal family, and that perspective could be invaluable as they learn to think of themselves as servants of the British people rather than people to be served." Thomas was struck by the thoughtfulness of their proposal. They had clearly considered not just what he might offer the children, but how such a role could provide meaning and purpose for him as well. The position they were describing would allow him to continue contributing to the royal household while accommodating his health needs. "This is an extraordinary opportunity," Thomas said. "I'm deeply honored that you would consider me for such a role. May I ask what prompted you to think of creating this position?" Prince William's expression became more personal. "Honestly, it was our observation of how George has flourished in his interactions with you. We've seen him become more confident in his understanding of his responsibilities, more thoughtful about the impact of his actions on others, and more excited about the positive aspects of his future role. When we learned about your health situation, we realized we didn't want to lose that influence from the children's lives." Catherine nodded. "We also recognize that as they get older, George and his siblings will need guidance from someone who isn't their parent or their formal tutor. Someone who can provide perspective without the emotional complications that come with family relationships or the rigid structure of academic instruction." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering practical details such as scheduling, compensation, and the physical accommodations that would be necessary for Thomas's health condition. Throughout the discussion, Thomas was impressed by their genuine concern for his well-being and their realistic understanding of what he could and could not contribute. As the meeting concluded, Prince William made a statement that would stay with Thomas for years to come. "Sergeant Mitchell, you've already given 3 decades of your life to serving our family. This new role isn't a favor we're doing for you. It's an acknowledgement that your service has been valuable, enough that we want to find ways to continue benefiting from your wisdom and experience." Thomas left the meeting with a formal offer to consider and a week to make his decision. As he walked through the palace corridors for what might have been his final time as an active guard, he reflected on the remarkable turn his life had taken. What had begun as a chance encounter with a lonely young prince had evolved into something that would reshape his entire future. The irony was not lost on him that Prince George's simple gesture of friendship had led to this opportunity. The boy's innate kindness and genuine interest in others had created a connection that was now extending Thomas's service to the royal family in ways he could never have anticipated. That evening, Thomas sat in his small flat and thought about Margaret. He could almost hear her voice encouraging him to embrace this new chapter, to see it as an opportunity to use his experience in service of something larger than himself. For the first time since her death, Thomas felt that his life was moving forward rather than simply continuing. The decision, when it came, was not difficult. The following morning, Thomas contacted the palace to accept the position. He would transition from royal guard to royal advisor, trading his uniform for a different kind of service that promised to be equally meaningful, but far more personal. Prince George's gentle gesture of friendship had indeed left the royal guard speechless, but it had also opened a door to possibilities that neither of them could have imagined when their paths first crossed in the palace gardens. 6 months after Thomas officially transitioned to his new role as royal advisor, the transformation in both his life and his relationship with the royal children was remarkable. The position had evolved naturally into something even more meaningful than what had originally been envisioned. During those initial conversations with Prince William and Catherine, Thomas's days now followed a completely different rhythm. Rather than standing at attention for hours at predetermined posts, he spent his time in comfortable offices within the palace, meeting with the children individually and in small groups. His schedule was flexible enough to accommodate his health needs, while still providing consistent support and guidance to Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. The formal aspects of his new role included regular sessions where Thomas shared stories from royal history, explained the reasoning behind various protocols and traditions, and helped the children understand the broader context of their positions within British society. But the real value of his work lay in the informal conversations and spontaneous moments of connection that occurred throughout each day. Prince George had thrived under this new arrangement. The boy who had once felt overwhelmed by the weight of his future responsibilities now approached his role with confidence and enthusiasm. Thomas had helped him understand that being royal was not about being perfect or distant, but about using his position to make positive differences in people's lives. During one memorable conversation, George had asked Thomas about the loneliness that sometimes came with royal life. Thomas had shared his own experiences of isolation after Margaret's death, and how George's friendship had helped him rediscover the importance of human connection. The prince had listened with rapt attention, then observed that perhaps one of the most important aspects of being royal was making sure that others never felt forgotten or unimportant. Princess Charlotte had also benefited from Thomas's guidance, particularly in understanding how to balance strength and compassion in leadership. At 8 years old, she possessed a natural assertiveness that could sometimes be misinterpreted as bossiness. Thomas helped her channel that energy into positive leadership qualities, teaching her how to advocate for others while remaining kind and approachable. Prince Louis, still very young, mostly enjoyed Thomas's presence as a gentle, grandfatherly figure who told wonderful stories and always had time to listen to his observations about the world around him. Thomas found particular joy in these interactions, remembering how Margaret had always hoped they would have children to share their love with. The palace staff had quickly recognized the positive impact of Thomas's new role. The royal children were noticeably more confident in their interactions with others, more aware of the experiences of people around them, and more excited about the positive aspects of their future responsibilities. Several staff members had privately commented to Thomas about how much more approachable and thoughtful the children had become. But perhaps the most significant change was in Thomas himself. The sense of purpose and connection that had been missing from his life since Margaret's death had returned in full measure. He woke each morning with genuine excitement about the day ahead, eager to see what insights or questions the children might bring to their conversations. His health had also improved, aided by the reduced physical demands of his new position and the positive emotional impact of meaningful work. The stress and fatigue that had characterized his final months as a guard had been replaced by a calm contentment that seemed to strengthen him both, physically and mentally. One particularly significant moment came on the anniversary of Thomas's first conversation with Prince George in the palace gardens. The prince had requested a private meeting, saying he had something important to discuss. When they met in Thomas's office, George presented him with a carefully handwritten letter. "Thomas," George said, his young face serious with emotion, "I wanted to write down some thoughts about what this year has meant to me. I know that my friendship changed your life, but I wanted you to understand how much you've changed mine as well." The letter, written in George's careful handwriting, expressed gratitude not just for Thomas's guidance and support, but for showing him that genuine service came from the heart, rather than from obligation. George wrote about how Thomas had helped him understand that being royal was not about being separate from others, but about finding ways to connect with and support people from all walks of life. Most touching of all was George's observation that Thomas had taught him the most important lesson of his young life. That the greatest privilege of his position was the opportunity to make others feel valued and important. The prince wrote that he hoped to spend his entire life living up to the example that Thomas had set for him. Reading the letter, Thomas felt a completeness that he had not experienced since Margaret's death. His life had found new meaning and direction through his relationship with this remarkable young prince, and he had been able to offer something valuable in return. The story of how Prince George's gentle gesture had led to Thomas's resignation from the royal guard had become something of a legend within the palace. Staff members who had witnessed the transformation spoke of it as an example of how genuine human connection could change lives in unexpected ways. But for Thomas and George, the story was not about dramatic gestures or life-changing moments. It was about the simple truth that kindness, consistently offered and gratefully received, had the power to create relationships that enriched everyone involved. As Thomas settled into his new life, he often thought about the chain of events that had brought him to this point. A lonely, grieving man had found renewed purpose through the friendship of a young boy who possessed wisdom far beyond his years. In return, that boy had gained a mentor who could help him navigate the unique challenges of his position while maintaining his essential humanity. Their story continued to unfold each day, marked not by grand gestures but by quiet conversations, shared insights, and the gradual deepening of a friendship that had begun with nothing more than a simple wave across a palace garden. Prince George's gentle gesture had indeed left the royal guard speechless, but it had also opened both their lives to possibilities neither had imagined, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of kindness.